and I will share my screen. Then I will start the presentation. And assuming I did everything correctly, which it looks like I did, we should be able to see evaluating working with light. Can I get a confirmation that is the case? Thumbs up, a chat.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Great. Okay, so, well, first of all, I want to thank the St. Croix Valley Camera Club for the invitation here. And I guess in the great spirit of everything, the Western Wisconsin Photo Club is here as well. So I'm looking forward to spending time with both you guys today. And I appreciate Mike and the crew there for the opportunity to come and speak. So I'm excited. So the recording is the presentation is being recorded. So you'll get a copy of it later. There's also going to be some materials in here. There's going to be a couple reference sheets about light. You'll get copies of those as well in the follow-up material. So you don't need to take pictures of the screen. If you see a chart you like, you'll get that as later anyways. So I am going to mute everybody and I'm going to, so everybody should be muted now. Oops, if I have to get that. And then you'll be allowed to unmute yourself when we get to the Q&A. So at the end, I'll take as much time Q&A, either light related, photography related, kind of whatever you want to go through. So we'll have time at the end for as many verbal questions and answers as you want, but there's also the chat box. So if those of you that don't know chat, which are still a couple, it's on the bottom toolbar within Zoom. There's the chat, and you can either send a message directly to me or you can chat to all the participants. So about particular questions, you can put them in there, and it's also a great way for me to go through and answer questions at the end. So plenty of opportunity to go through chat as well. So should be good. Okay, so I appreciate you coming here. My name is Nick Stover. I am a professional landscape photographer based in San Luis Obispo, California. I'm on the Central Coast in between LA and San Francisco. So a nice part of the world most of the times of the year. Although my love also is very much firmly rooted in the desert and also in the high mountains. So I enjoy the diverse landscapes, in particular the West. I'm actually leaving Wednesday morning to go into an area called the Maze District in Canyonlands. It'll be, I don't even know how many trips into the desert Southwest. So another love of an area for me, which should be an exciting trip. I was born and raised in Colorado, so I have a lot of the roots there as well. So I work with clients. I'll talk a little bit at the end, teaching a lot of online classes, doing workshops. And then in 2022, I'll be resuming in-field workshops. So I'm really excited about that. Obviously, I think as many of us are. So light, let's talk about this. And I would say it is the most talked about part of photography. I think also you could even say we as photographers, we're probably obsessed with it. Yeah. Because the simple fact is our photography cannot exist without light. And how we work with our light is vital to how we are able to showcase both our subjects and our scenes. But not just working with the light, also about understanding it and how it brings forth, or what the elements are that kind of bring out a lot of that life within our images. So for me, in the classes and the work I teach and the tutorials, et cetera, there's 5 things I've identified that bring out the most compelling images. The first is depth. How do we bring out dimensionality? This is where we focus on transition. So we'll show examples of this. Focus. Where and how do we want people to focus and to look within our images? Where do we want them to see? Light shapes are a huge portion of that. Sharpness. Not everything in images should go to near to far at the exact same sharpness. That which is closer to you should typically be in much more focus. That which is further away should be blurred. And we should start to see effects like atmospheric haze and other things we'll talk about. The next thing of a compelling image is texture. What do people want to touch within our images? How can we bring this out so people can have textures in this interaction? And then the final component of the 5 parts of a compelling image is luminosity. And this principle, which I'll talk about probably more than you want to hear, is the eye will always go to the brightest spots within an image. And this is where we focus on contrast, these differences between light and dark, which we'll talk about as well. So where and how do we see this used? Do we get the monopoly of this as landscape or nature photographers? Well, unfortunately not. We are not the first to really see of or recognize the value of light on the landscape. Thomas Moran put light on the landscape in a prime focus in this painting here, the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone in 1872. There's so many interesting elements that he used in this image to really create movement. That is one of our top goals in photography, is movement. How is the eye and the brain moving in and out and interacting with the scene? So when we look at an image like this, we have the warm tones. We have the warmth of where the sun's kind of flowing through and hitting the closer part and the warmer part. Then we have the luminosity values, that brightness of the waterfall and how we're drawn in towards the waterfall. Then we have the atmosphere that's created by that mist that's kind of going up through that. So there's so many elements that painters, the landscape painters of the grand Western age, as it was called in this time. This was Bierstadt in, I think, about 1868, painting Among the Sierra, his probably most famous painting. Interestingly enough, he painted this from his own studio in Rome, not from in the field, which kind of brings that illusion of like, wow, us as photographers, at least we have to be out in the field. But there's certain things within this image and a lot of his other work that's really, really how he used the light was so powerful. So many of us might think, well, the only reason these guys were painting is because photography, well, it didn't even exist. And that's not right, actually. So almost 50 years before these paintings, in 1826, almost 200 years ago, is when the first photograph was taken. Does this have the painterly qualities of a Bierstadt or Moran? Absolutely not. But this process, or this first image, was captured through a process called heliography, or drawing with the light, drawing with the sun, helios for sun and graphy, and was used in this thing called bitumen of Judea, which coated onto a piece of glass or metal. And that doesn't mean anything besides the concept of the bitumen hardened in the proportion of the amount of light that's striking this. And we'll come back to this because that principle is not too different from what we experience today. Yes, photography literally means drawing with light. Photos meaning light, which is not too different than heliography meaning sun, and graphe meaning drawing or writing. So 194 years ago, someone drew onto a piece of glass. And today we draw onto our camera sensors and we paint and enhance our images in Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever your processing program of choice is. But in between the time of heliography and the modern landscape painters and our digital devices today, we had someone who knew more than a little bit about light and the importance of it. This is George Eastman. This is the man who launched the age of film. And Eastman speaks about how light makes photography. Embrace it, admire it, love it, but above all, know it. And know it for all you are worth, and you will know the key to photography. And you know what changed since George Eastman spoke these words? Absolutely nothing. Light today is just as important for photography. And even today, we're starting to get these new masters of modern light using these digital devices. People like Mark Adamus. Mark's an expedition workshop leader, leads workshops all over the world in some of the remotest areas. And his use of light, especially in the Arctic areas, is absolutely magical. Or Joshua Snow, his light bleeding techniques, really, he says, modeled after Bierstadt, and what he's trying to look or showcase within the scenes brings out some of that painterly quality. Or Erin Bobnick. Erin has her master's in fine art, and she knows what conditions need to be there within the landscape to bring out what she wants to bring forth. She said that she took 7 days to capture this image the way she wanted, with just the right amount of lighting coming in onto the dry mud tiles. Now, that's good patience, but that's also mastery work. So let's talk about some of this transition stuff and who I see or who I look to. So Galen Roll, he was a wilderness photographer, adventure journalist, and climber. And this individual, and from 1972 until 2002, when he died in a small plane crash, unfortunately, in the Sierra, he brought photography to life far more than anyone else since Ansel Adams. And what he studied and knew more of was this concept of mountain light. So he took us with his camera to places that most people never dreamed. And his images brought forth the reality that many people didn't exist. But he also thought about light differently. And he speaks about our ability to maximize our time using the light. And as good photographers, we know the value of a sunrise and a sunset. We know how few of those we get in conjunction with the so many days on the planet. So let's make use of it and let's talk about it. So how do we think about this light? So what exists between the masters of old and the emerging masters of today is we all have this opportunity for our own dialogue with light. The thing is, at sunset or sunrise, the light itself doesn't actually change what's going on. What goes on at these periods of time, and it's something to keep in mind, which is a lighting principle, is it's light that is traveling, and the light itself is not changing, but what is happening is dust, particulates, fog, mist, other things out there in our atmosphere. Our low-level atmosphere is diffracting and amplifying and muting this light in all kinds of different ways. And in part, that's what's starting to soften it. So when we think about light and we're trying to find the right kind of lights for our scene and our situation, we should be looking at these ways that the light is being somewhat modified from the natural thing we see on a summer day when the light is directly above our head. So we need to find ways to mute it and kind of get that to us. And what do we actually see? Well, how do we view light? Well, the only way to really answer that question is to talk about our digital device of choice or our camera. These are absolutely amazing pieces of technology. Look at all these mirrors and sensors and lenses and balls and rotations, etc., serving one singular purpose. All of the light from what we see to what comes through goes to one place, our sensor. So that is all our camera really does, is it captures or harvests the light that we see. So for today, I wanted you to think about it just a little bit differently. For this presentation, let's think of it as a light harvester. That is the role of our camera. And in thinking of our camera as a light harvester, that doesn't take away from our creative process. It actually adds to it, because that means we are the ones that are in control of this mechanical piece of equipment. So let's figure out where to point that machine. So we ourselves as humans are the best light harvesters. Our eye is better than any camera. 576 megapixel equivalent, nighttime ISO of 800. We can change our depth of field instantaneously. And the only limitation we have is when our focal length is fixed at mainly 22 millimeters. But what we see and we encounter is that the camera sees the world differently than the human eye. And sometimes the way the camera sees it versus the eye can make a more powerful image than what is actually observed. This is where we start talking about things like long exposure or capturing of things in instantaneous things that are too fast for the eye to even see, in addition to different types of features and benefits. So we'll look at that. So how does your camera compared to the eye, or how do we see the light that's on there? Well, the range of light on this planet is about 30 stops. The human eye can see, at our best, about 24 of these stops, leaving 6 stops of light that the eye itself can't even capture. We're talking about the darkest of darks and the brightest of brights. Then we take this down one layer further to what the camera can capture. Our digital devices today can capture about 14, 15 stops of light. Then we have to look at one final thing, and I think this is a key thing to really consider: the 10-stop rule. And the 10-stop rule has to do with this. So the way I describe it, our printers, how do you like that for a word? Our printers and our monitors, see, I combined it, trying to be efficient. Our printers and our monitors can see or display about 10 stops of light. So we take all of these things down and we talk about bracketing, or the need for exposure blending, or HDRs, et cetera. The purpose of that is to recover these select periods of that 10 stops, not to try to get back to the 24 stops that our eyes can see, nor necessarily even the 14 stops our camera can capture, but selectively bringing back particular parts within our images. So how do we do that? Well, how do we control our light harvesters? Well, the number one way to do this, and I'll reinforce this time and time again for new and old alike, is to photograph raw. First, raw. Raw gives us the most flexibility, the most variability, the most decisions, the most everything we want to do in our images by photographing with raw, because we maintain the control. The second most important thing, and I'd say raw is the most important, it's the most crucial element. The second most is to be photographing in manual mode or aperture priority, if that's your preference, but not to be photographing in auto mode, and to really understand this exposure triangle. So the exposure triangle doing is all we're doing is balancing all of these different variables and controlling how the light is actually impacting our sensor. We're thinking about how much light should be hitting our sensor and what do we want those qualities to look like. So if you're not familiar with the exposure triangle, YouTube videos all over the place about the exposure triangle. I'll have a free series coming out in the fall to talk about this. I don't think this should be something that anyone should charge for. Everybody should understand exposure triangle and how to process a raw image, because these two things are vital to bring forth what we want to see. And these are the number one things to control it. All right, so that's how we see it. That's how we control it. Now let's talk about what it starts to look like. So if you ask the question about which one of these looks longer or shorter, and look at it for a second. So most people are going to answer, well, the one on the right looks longer. And they would be correct. It does look longer for most people. Most people would say the one on the right looks distant. It looks like it has more depth. The secondary question would be, which one of the two do you notice sooner? So look away and then look back. Which one of the two does your eye gravitate towards the soonest? And most people would tell you the one on the left. Their eye notices that first, but why? Well, there's a principle at work here, and I'll show you the science behind it. The first thing is blue or cooler tones in our images tend to recede. They tend to feel further away, while warmer tones tend to advance and will grab our attention first. But why? It's because our eye simply doesn't have a choice. We are programmed through our cones and our rods and the way we see things to see the longest wavelength light the soonest. These are the warm tones in our images, the reds, the oranges, the yellows. The cooler tones are the shorter wavelengths, the blues, the teals, the purples. So these wavelengths of these colors, we just don't see them as quickly or inherently as that longer wavelength. So it goes back to that principle. The eye will always go to the brightest parts of the image. So it's the key thing to look at. All right, so now let's talk about what is the value of light in our photographs. How do we use and work with the light within our photography? Well, first things first, I think, is how does light interact with our scene? How does that interaction in an instance like this in the Tetons begin to create things for us? The value of the light on the mountains in parallel with the light on the fog. How is that kind of thing that's going on between the moose and kind of that really early light as the moose is moving through the scene? How does the light kind of still go through, and what does that do? So what these kind of things do is they bring about depth and progression. So one of the main values of light is it helps us to show or demonstrate progression in our images. It helps the eye to make leaps within our images. And if we can help the eye or the brain to make leaps and kind of work its way through an image, we bring back some dimensionality. We restore some of that three-dimensional world which we've lost under our two-dimensional objects. And then the gradients of brightness, we start to get layers and levels within our images. So these levels of space, this depth of progression is giving that viewer the opportunity to really work through the image in a way and have interaction. Interaction is one of the top goals with our images. The other value light creates, or another example of that, is the movement between the warms and the cools. So we have the warms of the setting sun back in this area, and then we have the cools of the seaweed, a little bit of the ocean that's not getting any direct light. We're getting that interaction. We can start to explore the textures as well. So as we're doing this interaction, kind of going back and forth between the warms and the cools, we're getting some of that wispiness of the ocean, maybe a little of the textures of the seaweed. And so without these variations in our images, we have a flat image. And a flat image to me means something that's not being interacted with. And that is not what we want. We want our images to have interaction. And we want our images to have what is my favorite word, cohesion. Cohesion. So how do things cohesively work together and operate in a scene or a situation like this. So one of the principles of cohesion, and I'll send you this chart as well, is understanding different ways to speak about and also start to recognize light. I kind of started getting bored a few years ago when I'd go out to photograph sunset and I'd come back home and my wife would ask, "How was the sun tonight?" And I would just grunt, good, or whatever else, versus being able to really recognize the variations that I saw out there. And I've seen them in the mountain environments and then the winter environments, et cetera. But to really understand a little bit about it and be able to describe it better. So tonight, I think we're going to get some more descriptors to help us speak the language of light and to increase our vocabulary about how we do that. So the hows exactly is broken down into, in my work, 4 characteristics of light, or there's 4 ways I choose to describe light. We have angle, we have direction, we have color, we have intensity. So I'll give you a copy of this graphic as well. And now we're going to go through these ones in great detail. So we're going to go through these again and again on different images and talk about different examples and the characteristics, et cetera. So coming back to this one. Okay, so let's start with angle. And I like Galen's description of it here. The landscape is like being there with a powerful personality. And I'm searching for just the right angles to make that portrait come across as meaningful as possible. So some people question me about my work and not doing any portrait work or whatever else. And I sometimes say that there's just so much power in the landscapes that I'm in and the environment I've raised. And I had never thought about just trying to get the angles correctly in that showcasing of that powerful personality. So it's the key part. So angle. So we start with the easy one. We really only have 2 choices here. We have high angle light, like we see here in the wave on the Arizona-Utah border. This is our typical midday light. There's much, much more white light. Going back to that early principle, it's not getting diffracted or reflected. It's just coming straight down through the troposphere and all the other spheres up above us. I won't go into the ionospheres, et cetera. And it's going to bring out very little shadow detail. It can sometimes be seen as harsh. But what this light does is it allows that uniform light over the entire scene to really bring forth an image without having a lot of shadow detail that has a different impact than what we see with low angle light. Low angle light, it's usually a much warmer light. We might lose some of those shadows, but we get much, much better detail and better transitions within our images. So we're going to be looking only at 2 angles, high angle and low angle, one sometimes a moderate angle, but those are the 2 general ones we're looking at. The next characteristic is direction. And once again, I'm going back to Galen. I find some of the hardest photography and the most challenging. Yes, that's the second part, the most challenging I've ever done. It's a real challenge to work with natural features and the natural light. Yes, we're not portrait photographers with our lighting setups, nor are we shooting within a studio or doing something else. We're working in the natural features that are in the land and then trying to pair and work with that natural light. So we can't control the direction of the light that's coming, but what we can do is recognize what we're dealing with and begin to work with it. So let's start with front light. So front light is my least favorite light. Yes, I can pick a least favorite. I'm not going to offend the light gods. This is where the light is striking the front of an image. So don't be confused because the light itself is actually at my back in this image in the Tetons. But what is happening is it's striking the image. And the reason I don't like this light is it has a tendency to flatten the image out. It's a little more harsh than other images. And I photograph this oftentimes in mountain settings, but you can sometimes also find it in other places and scenes where the sun's coming up and kind of hitting the thing. And what you see when you look at a scene like this is that front light is very harsh. But when you look at that reflection in the water down below, you can notice that you can see even more detail in the reflection of the Grand Teton than you can in the actual image itself. And what we have going on here is some of that diffusing of it, that softening of what's going on. We can also look at a scene like this and pretty quickly determine the angle. So it's a low angle light because we can see so much shadow detail within the trees. We can see kind of these little pockets of where the light's coming in. So we still have some dimensionality with the front light versus once the sun's up and there's no shadows, we're really going to have that harsh light scenario. The next one is backlighting. And this is whenever the light is in front of our, our subject is in front of our light of choice, which is typically going to be the sun. This is generally referred to as backlighting. This is really good for showing detail and texture, whether it's moss hanging down, or in this particular case, in some of the oak trees here on the Central Coast, I wanted to show the branching patterns that exist, or the veining within these trees, and things that could kind of be there. Since you'll often be shooting directly into the sun, you want to be careful about how you're managing it. So we're either going to be looking at bracketing, or we're going to be underexposing the image a little bit and creating that silhouette effect like we see here. So it's a low angle light. So this scene was particularly planned. I knew I'd get the sun kind of setting out over the ocean quite a ways off in the distance. This is inland a little ways. And oftentimes you get that glow kind of coming through. So I got that light variation glow I was going for. The next part of backlighting was one of my favorite things to do with my wide angle. Use the small aperture. So this goes back to that value of manual mode. So an f16 to f22 aperture. You shoot this image in auto mode, your camera's not going to know, hey, he wants a sun star. So you have to be able to program your camera to do exactly what you want it to do. So I knew I wanted a sun star here. I set it to f16. I shot the image and I got what I wanted. And what this does is it really focuses the person into the image exactly what I want them to see. I want them to go right to this arch. I want them to follow the lines within there. So it's a dramatic effect that really pulls you in. You can't really get sun stars very effectively midday. You need to have something that's blocking it, as many of you know. And then the other part of it is to have it lower in the sun so it's a little softened to come through. So we got front light, we got backlight. How about side light? Yes, I get to finally pick a favorite. I love side light. And the reason I love side light is it's dimensional. So this goes back to one of the things I talked about earlier, bringing out depth and dimension. It helps us to define the shapes of our subject. It helps us to show the sizes, to be able to see into the subjects a little bit further. So these are low angle side lights typically. You're not going to get a high angle side light. You're going to get that low angle, creating those shadows and those details across the textures. All right, the next two are a little bit of a stretch, but bear with me. Top lighting is a category I actually consider as a category. Most people who just say, well, that's just midday light or that's just high angle light. But top lighting is random and it is hard to come by, but you will see it. You'll sometimes see it in cloud cover in the middle of the day when we get our sepulchral rays kind of coming down, the old God rays. We'll see some of that top lighting phenomenon, which goes into some of the intensity things we'll talk about. We'll see it in places like slot canyons, like this here in Antelope Canyon, where we have the dust, light beams coming down. We have dust that's getting thrown up into it to create and show those light beams as well. So it's a harsher light. The light is typically directly above you, but we can see top lighting. And then the other thing we can sometimes see is down lighting. And so you need to be directly above something to get this effect. This isn't something you can necessarily get from a high peak, but you can get it from a plane or a drone. In this case, I got it from a plane. It's just a legal image. And what it shows you is the depth of something. And you see that color gradient play out right before your eyes in the depth of the grand prismatic. So if I go back, let's see, 10 slides or so. See, we have our blues, our teals, more of our purples, our blues, our teals, greens, our yellows, our oranges, our reds, kind of playing out in direct thing related to the depth of what's down there. And we immediately go back to the grand prismatic and we see this play out directly in front of our eye. That high angle light where the depth down there is that really dark, or the blues. Then we get a little bit lighter, then we get in the teals, then we get the yellows, then we get the reds as it kind of goes out. And this is not different colored algae within the scene. It's just the way that the light reflects. And so these are the principles we start to see as light gets more closer to us. It'll reflect and kind of see things as well. So down lighting is a scenario, something to be looking at as well. Okay, so we've covered angle and direction. Way to go, guys. Now we got color and then we got intensity less. And so let's talk about light in an interesting way. And so Galen also, once again, like I said, I was going to come back to him. I like to anchor my presentations on particular people that have spent time doing something. So this one's about a little more about Galen Roll. Other ones are about Ed Abbey or John Muir, et cetera. And we almost got to look at this a little bit differently. And he talks about my means, nor do I think of my camera as a means recording a matter, an animal or a mountain, unless I absolutely need a record shot. And when he talks about a record shot, it's when he was on assignment and he needed to get a shot to be able to fulfill the piece. And then he would go in search of something else that was more interesting or more dramatic. And he talks about it. When we think about it too, my first thought is always the light. And I want to encourage you to have the same thought anytime you go out into the landscape about the light, what's going on, becoming students of light, et cetera, because it becomes a big part of it. So we took a big step today in being part of the class. Now we're going to talk about the color of it. So we all know Roy G. Biv from the rainbows, but unless we're seeing that rainbow, which we do see from time to time, we're not seeing that in other parts and pieces within our photography. What I want to show you here is that color of light and how we also just have a tendency to dismiss it. Excuse me. So this is an intentional camera movement at a sunset down in Pismo Beach, just south of me. And what we have going on here is we have the area with just outside of the tide line down here, where the waves have kind of lapped. And then we have the waves themselves right here. And then we got the ocean kind of out in the mid area here, a little bit of waves capturing here, and then the horizon, and then the sunset, and then the clouds above the sunset. And so what we see in a scene like this is we have a tendency when we're looking at a scene like this as photographers to go right over the top of everything else and look just at that beautiful sunset versus really seeing all the different color variation that exists within our scene that's playing out within there. So that's one thing to think about in the color of light, but there's actually only really two colors of light. One is cool. Light is typically described as cool in the blue hour, which I think many of you know is that time 1 hour before sunset to maybe 1 hour after sunset. You get up into the polar latitudes, like here in Alaska in early March, the blue hour will last a very long time. And then you start to feel very blue because you're dang cold. But that's my own problem. So it brings about oftentimes that coldness that we're within the scenes. It portrays kind of a coldness, but not always. So cool light is also called blue light. So they kind of are used interchangeably. Cool or blue the benefit of working in this light, and why it's become one of my favorites is you don't get any direct light on the landscape during the blue hour. Rather, it's reflected or indirect light. So it's basically the light from the sun bouncing off the atmosphere and kind of casting everything into a soft blue light. And so this type of light I really like for creating evenly lit or ethereal photos because there's no direct light. We're not dealing with a lot of highlight or contrast issues. And they sometimes have a little bit lower contrast and more of a moodiness to kind of feel all the way through. But blue light is not always blue. It won't change red sandstone to blue sandstone, for example. But what it does help to do is to cast an even light over a scene. So things become much more subtle in our images. You need to lengthen your exposure to absorb the light that is much less visible to your eye. So this is Yant Flat. This is just outside of St. George. And I've been out here for, 4 or 5 hours, loving the rock textures, seeing the shapes, etc. And I couldn't get the image I wanted until that sun was way gone. We were well into the blue hour. This is a 5-second exposure at ISO 320. So think about that for a couple of perspectives. 5 seconds at 320. So a very, very long exposure. If I'd been in ISO 100, this would have been probably a 15-second exposure. My eye could barely see what was there, but I knew my camera sensor could capture and bring that back. And it was because that light was so subtle as it's gone down that I was able to bring out the textures. You could see the lichen on there. You could see this kind of wave formation within the rock. You could still get a little bit of that blue light within the sky to really bring out the vision that I'd had on this particular day. So we got blue light and kind of the examples of those. Now let's talk about, I think, most photographers' favorite light. And I'm not going to rule this one out myself. I love it a lot. And this is the golden hour, which is what we're most familiar with, the time kind of leading up to and a little bit after sunset, maybe 20 minutes before, includes the sunset time about 20 minutes after. So in good scenario, maybe we have 40 minutes of golden blue light, warm hour, golden warm light hour. And what this light is so great is it's really great for exaggerating textures and details. It brings back some of that dimensionality as well. So it's also that low angle light within our scene. We catch it when it's just a little bit higher or a little bit different days. We can also get some of that atmospheric rays kind of going through our images, the dramatic landscape photos. And this is a kind of a two-part thing. We get the warms and the cools kind of playing off each other. And the eye likes to move between warms and cools. So it likes to look at the blue of the sky and then bathe itself back in the warmth of the sunset and back maybe to the colors in the ocean and the reflections that are here. And so that golden light really continues to be a dramatic light. So you probably go, okay, well, we have cool light and blue light. What about, and then you'd be right, we have neutral or mixed light oftentimes. And this is another great opportunity to create a lot of depth within our images, where we get that interplay between the highlights and the shadows, where we can bring out more textures and colors. So this one here is a mix of a little bit of like I would say not really diffuse light, because it was a pretty harsh sky. So this is in Eureka Dunes in Death Valley. And so where I am, I'm completely in the shade and I'm hunkering down, wanting my textures on my piece of well stuck out mud tile as I'm sitting there freezing my tail off, and wanting that warmth coming through on the scene up there and show those textures on the sand dune that are there, and timing it in such a way that I have enough warmth there to kind of counteract that coolness and the lines down within it. So finding that neutral and mixed portion as well. Okay, so the characteristics of light, we're going on to the fourth. We did angle, direction, color. Now we have intensity. So the final quote from Galen, even though we have a lot more stuff to cover, when the light is right and everything is working for me. Yes, we all know what that feels like. And if we don't, we're going to find it soon. Sometimes mere seconds can make a difference between a superb image and a mundane one. And I have a lot of examples I'll show that, because sometimes that is exactly what happens when we're dealing with intense things, especially intense atmospheric phenomena. It can be mere seconds that'll sometimes determine what we're dealing with. So let's talk about intensity. People talk about the intensity or what we're dealing with, and one of the most used things, oh, the light was harsh. And the harsh is, the truth is, yeah, that's a very kind of vocal thing, but the truth is intensity is not always an all on or all off type of thing. And so the light may be harsh, but we can sometimes find ways to work with it. And so this is an example of very harsh light that is pounding it's coming up harsh over the, let me reset on this one. Harsh light, let me take a drink. Okay, so this is Cottonwood Lakes in the up above Lone Pine in the Sierra. I'm at about 11,000 feet. And any of you that ever backpacked in the high Sierra or been up there, when the sun comes up in the summer months, it goes from golden hour to harsh hour in seconds, because the sun is rising up over the Death Valley kind of entire very area over there. And there's no particulates in the clouds over there. That is some of the driest land anywhere in the US. And so the Sierra light can be beautiful in storm conditions, but oftentimes when the sun rises, it'll be very harsh. And so this is that example of working with the harsh light. So seeing the light hitting off of the granite face and reflecting back onto the water, but then producing an effect that I very rarely see, and that is called refracted light. So refracted is where the light hits something else and takes on a different form. And so we see these little refracted whirlpools within this whole entire scene and the setting. In addition to that, that refracted and reflected, I'm trying to combine words today, I don't know why. Refracted and reflected together also bring about that play we were talking about earlier between the warms and the cools. So it brings out a lot of that dimensionality as well. So we're looking for ways sometimes with harsh light to soften it and see the secondary forms it takes on. So the secondary form that sometimes when we don't get into refracted situations is reflected. So this is where it bounces off one object and then is cast onto another. So this is just outside of Telluride, fall colors last year. And the light coming down midday here was just super harsh on the beautiful aspen trees. But as it reflected off and hit this lake that was getting just enough of the water, just enough wind to kind of mess things up a little bit, it brought out more of that painterly quality, really softened the scene a lot. So that harsh high angle light starts to become a much, much smoother soft. The next one, which is not really a reflected portion, it's much about keeping it out, is the ambient lighting. And this lighting can be subtle and warm, and it produces oftentimes a more pleasing, where we get more feathered shadows and allowing colors and textures to appear distinct. So this scene has angular, jagged lines, and with direct light on it, it feels very agitating. But in an ambient light, one that's kind of diffused as it works its way through, those hard edges become stronger elements. They don't become off-putting. Side tip on ambient light creation for intimate landscapes. I asked my backpacking partner to stand there and block a portion of the sun to create this scene. So the light was mostly blocked, but there was this one beam coming through that was just messing up the whole thing. And I said, hey, Tom, block that beam for me. And he blocked it, and I got the scene I wanted with that ambient light kind of bathing over the whole scene. The next part is diffused light, overcast conditions or certain locations. So this is a butterfly swarm just south here in Pismo Beach. And this works really well for things with lots of textures, because with bright light, you don't preserve any of the details. I've judged plenty of photo contests to see beautiful images of monarchs that are blown out completely. Their bright spots are very difficult to photograph. And so finding diffused light on a cloudy day when the light is just kind of oozing into the scene and really being able to get what you want. That direction is less important in diffuse light, and you can really work within a scene and bring out particular things. Also is flat or even light. So this is also during those overcast days. You can sometimes see it maybe a little bit in that pre-dawn hours as well, where you're not getting direct light on the landscape. And the reason I love flat and even light is it's really great to be able to go slow. So we talk about going fast within the landscape and needing to be ready to capture certain scenes kind of right away. But oftentimes flat or even light, you can really take the time to immerse yourself in a scene. So this is the H-O-H Rainforest Trail. And it had been about a 4-hour hike to this point, taking images with my wide angle. It was the first time I'd ever photographed rainforest. Wide angle and hating everything I'd taken, trying different ones in this regard, thinking too flat, etc. And then all of a sudden the storm started to break up, and I started to see some separation within the scene. And I started to see the scene a little bit differently. Oh, I can see different colors here. The light's kind of coming through to the left. Oh, I need a leading line to kind of bring some order to this chaos, etc. So in bright light, I never would have had that chance. But with the flat or even light, I was really able to kind of A, spend the time, and B, really get immersed into that particular scene. On the other side of this is spotlighting. So spotlighting is that rare light. We see those breaks in the clouds. We need to be oftentimes ready. Oftentimes can come sometimes with vegetation. So no matter where spotlighting is coming down through tree branches or other things. So be on the lookout for spotlighting as storms either are forming or they're breaking up. Teams find better light personally when they're breaking up. And what you can do is be watching the clouds. So this particular day, I was watching the clouds, what was going on. I was getting the semicircular rays, the little circle beams, all the way out, way further out in the ocean, which are great to look at. And I was looking at the way the clouds are moving and the sun was setting kind of back to the right a little bit as well. And I thought, wonder if those rays are going to get closer to shore. And if so, where might they hit, where might be an interest. And so I put myself in position on this great rock and was able to capture the rays as they started to hit this particular place. So that spotlighting functionality really helps. The next one is harsh light, which in itself actually is its own category. And the only purpose it really has is to convey the dramatic. So I intentionally kept this image processed the way it is, because what you can see is that foreground in this image is just not that interesting. It's pretty dull. It's pretty lifeless. Because the light itself is so bright. So even with these great dynamic ranges and even potentially with bracketing and other things, you're just not going to capture that. So when you're finding these really, really strong displays of harsh light, the emphasis should be on the light itself. So this was like an extreme low angle backlighting. This is in Camino del Rey in Spain. It's this really famous walkway through this old caverns and not caverns, old canyon area. And what happens, which I didn't know, is at sunrise time, the light comes up the valley and it pushes all the mist up to the end. And so we're walking up to get ready to get started. And I was like, whoa, Didn't see that coming. Didn't have a tripod because they're not allowed, and just got to get an amazing display of harsh light. And then the final one of the intensities of light, and then we'll talk about how to use light, is dappled light. And this is that kind of a mix of even lighting and spot lighting. I love dappled light. You're going to see this when the sun is still relatively high. And cloud cover is like 50% or more. The direct effect of the soft shadows alternating with the bright spotlight areas can be very dramatic. These are great types of weather conditions for time lapses. And these sorts of conditions as well, it's best just to sit and stay put, find a good composition, and kind of let the light come to you. So this is called Blue Lake. It's a backpacking route quite remote in the Sierra. This is Banner and Ritter, two of the more famous minarets, which are just outside of Mammoth. And I wanted these two to catch some light. I wanted these two high peaks to be there. And so I just needed to wait until the dappled light kind of moved its way through and kind of highlighted those two peaks up there. So dappled light's a great one to work for. Okay, so now let's talk about how we can most effectively use light in our images. So this is a well. This is actually, that's funny. I just realized that this was sunset. And this was actually earlier in the day. So sometimes my images that are favorites come in twos. That's great. Actually, I just realized that. So this was actually backpacking to the Blue Lakes area and watching the scene and how we could use it. And so I was seeing the sun kind of coming up over the canyons. This was probably 10:30 in the morning. Really deep canyons were kind of going through here and just keeping my eye on what was going on. So this was actually behind us. And I was just watching, okay, light's starting to come in. Is there anything interesting happening? And bang, we got this beautiful waterfall crescendoing down with the tree just catching that little tip. So great lines, et cetera. So working the scene and watching the light. So going back to the early principles, my thought is always on light. Light not in front of me, but the light of where it is and kind of where it's coming through. We also talk about the focusing attention. So this goes back to the image from earlier and really using that to bring forth a lot of the focus, directing the eye exactly what we want to do. So the use of sun stars is probably one of my top choices. So if I go into a scene or a situation, I'm looking for reflections. I'm looking for great sunsets, obviously, but you can't always get them. Is there really interesting things to focus, or how can I potentially integrate sun stars into the images, et cetera? So the opportunity to bring focus. The other one, which I mentioned earlier, and I want to demonstrate here, is to demonstrate transitions. The way that the light strikes the landscape can create so much of that movement we want within our images. Going back to what I talked about earlier of textures and colors. So we have that warmth. The eye's going right into that warm dune that's getting direct light and examining those textures. And then we're looking at the secondary lines and the ripples, and then we're backing off and maybe we're looking at something else. So we see that warm and cool pairing, that highlight shadow kind of thing that's going on. That's creating a lot of that transitions, that interactions to the images. The other part of it is that storytelling component. So this one I call Heart of Stone. This is on another backpacking trip in the Sierra. So the sun's coming up kind of over this area, and I'm just luckily looking down at this particular moment and see a heart-shaped thing of flowers with the light almost perfectly splitting the heart and almost perfectly splitting the stone. A, not photoshopped, B, actually captured this way, but wanting to tell the story. So the first process I did of this, as you can see down here on the left, was black and white, and it was way too dark. And you couldn't see the shape of the form that's below that. And what we're looking for, there's actually a word for it. It's called chiaroscuro, and that's the Italian word for light and shadow. And so in a scene, in a situation like this, we're looking for that play between the light and shadow, where you can tell something's in shadow, but you can still see what it is. You can still make out the form. You can still see what's going on there. So you're getting so much of that interplay between that. And so with this kind of stuff and this kind of lighting, you can really put the emphasis onto the form and how the light falls onto it. So painters, portrait photographers, black and white photographers, they know chiaroscuro very well. But we as landscape photographers, we can claim the lights for it too. The other thing about it is we can use it to produce different effects. So paying attention to where the light is coming from can bring out those textures in photography. So this particular scene, this was a Milky Way image, obviously, as you can see here, there's a Milky Way. Good. Way to go, Captain Obvious, Nick. But what's interesting about this image, it's a 2-image blend. And so I photographed one about 40 minutes after sunset to be able to capture the textures I wanted in the sand. And then I waited another 45 minutes and captured another image for the Milky Way with those leading lines and the textures, and then blended the 2 images together very simply in Photoshop to bring forth something with depth and dimensionality and texture. Because when you're photographing the night sky, there was 0 detail. You couldn't even tell there was a sand dune there because there's just no ambient light to create those effects, those textures as well within our images. The other parts of it is, ways to break out of our normal mode or see the scenes differently. So this is Two Jack. This was in Canada 3 years ago. Actually, my only sunrise in 4 weeks in Canada that was worth documenting, but that's a story for another time. And what I saw that particular day is beautiful light in the clouds. And oh, look at that peak just lighting up in the lake. But I hated the horizontal line. They were dividing up. They weren't letting the lines, the eye kind of flow through. So it was like, how can I see the scene differently? Well, the clouds are probably moving fast enough, and there's probably enough motion in the water to really flatten it out. So I'm going to put on my neutral density, and I'm going to really flatten out the water. I'm going to create some more movement within the clouds that are going to bring out a different feel. So it's about working to see the scene differently. The next part of it is revisiting locations in different types of light. And so this is the Oceano Dunes, and you've seen a couple of these images already in the presentation. But one of the things I like about it is going back there at all kinds of different times of light, sunrise light, working with side light, shooting directly into the sun, looking at transitions and shadows, shooting well after the sun's gone down into that blue hour period, and how these different types of lighting really brings out and showcases different textures, different shapes, different forms within the sand dunes. So finding places you go to frequently and going back to them in different types of light to kind of work your scenes. Another experiment, which I haven't done, this is actually not one of mine. This is from my friend David Kingham with Exploring Exposure. And David did this in Death Valley. And they're slightly different dunes, but what he's showing is slightly different textures, I say. What he's showing is the way that the light changes. So before sunset all the way to after sunset, and how much difference occurs in the lighting of the object just based on when the sun is in the sky. And this has to do in this particular for sand. Sand is made of silica, which is basically glass. So this makes sense. But thinking about this in a lot of our different scenes is, don't think, oh, I got it in this particular light, but how might this scene look different in different types of light as we go through it? And then the other thing, which I can't say enough actually, is to photograph for black and white. It's an afterthought for many photographers. Oh, I'm just going to convert it to black and white, or I wonder what it'll look like, versus genuinely seeing the scenes. And black and white photographers, those that practice black and white, they see the world differently than color photographers. They can focus more on the light. They oftentimes focus more on the lighting or the composition, what's going on. So this is in the Canary Islands in Spain. And I was looking at what was going on within the scene. I liked the lines of the way the wisps were going as the water was going out. We had some good cloud movement in place. And I thought this could be a really good black and white image. So looking and photographing for black and white. So when you're photographing for black and white, you can actually change, and I'll talk about this in my black and white photography class next month. You can change your LCD, your display on your camera to show black and white previews. It's still capturing the full color raw, but you can start to see it. And if you convert your images, or if you're capturing in the field, you will see the forms going on a lot differently. I guarantee that. So photographing for black and white will help you to understand different ways that the light occurs within your scenes. Okay, so let's talk one final thing, and then I'm going to close with a couple quick things and then get into the Q&A as much time as you guys have, is working with the light we have. So how do I personally go about creating more depth and life in my image? And I put those two together, depth and life, because they all really do go together. One of the top ways I do in post-processing is dodging and burning. So lightening and darkening selectively. I do this through luminosity masking more so than anything else lately, because it really can subtly change the ever so slightly change the light within our image. The next one I will tell you is localized adjustments versus global adjustments. And so I use localized adjustments extremely aggressively, or I should say proficiently, in Lightroom, not aggressively. And when I use these, I'm doing these subtle adjustments, radial filters, gradual filters, brushes, and doing subtle things to particular parts of the image to really bring those out versus global adjustments. You're going to globally change everything when there's so local adjustments make a huge difference. The next key thing is spending more time on white balance than on any other image, any other setting, excuse me. So white balance is the crucial. This is how accurate the colors in our images are being displayed. So those of you that see me on camera today, I have a whole wall of what I would consider pretty nice images. I also have another wall in my basement of images that aren't ever going to see the public's eye again. And every single one of those images down below, I didn't have my white balance correct. So spending time on white balance, I show a technique. I'll tell you at some point in time or in upcoming classes, but I'll tell you now, you can increase your vibrance and saturation to plus 100 and then adjust your white balance. And so that things where sun shouldn't be aren't looking bright or warm, things where the shadows should be or not looking bright or orange is the best way to say it. And then areas that should be getting direct light are not looking blue or having casts. And if you do this minor adjustment and kind of keep working your white balance until you find that right balance and then reset your vibrance and saturation, you're going to be well better off than trusting a program, et cetera. So spend the time on white balance. Lots of the luminosity masking. I'm continuing to learn more and more about this. I'm teaching a class, another class in April on this. It's really, really powerful. Luminosity masks are all about the lights and the darks. And as the more time I spend with luminosity masks, the better I see the lights and the darks within my images, and I can start to visualize. Selectively painting tones. When we talk about this, this is where we're going to look at brightening or darkening through the warmth within our images or the color. So how are we going to warm up particular areas and cool off others in that way that the eye works between the warms and the cools? And then the final thing on the depth is light painting. So it doesn't have to be necessarily as aggressive as Josh Snow we saw earlier on, but light painting and bleeding some of that light we're seeing within the scenes into parts and pieces of our images. So final couple things go through. One is, like I said, I'm going to Utah, so I won't be teaching any more classes this month. But in April, I'm going to be hitting it hard. I'm doing a class on taking control of Photoshop. Then one of my favorite classes to teach on preparing your images for print. And then the magic of luminosity masks. And then I'm doing a couple more classes on black and white. And then a 2-day workshop on seascape photography or water photography. So love to see you for those. The All About Photoshop class goes into great detail about all the things, different parts and pieces in Photoshop you may or may not know about. And then also, I haven't announced these officially, but you guys will be added to my newsletter and you can opt out anytime you want. No questions asked. These will get announced probably after I get back first week of April, somewhere in there, about these processing pods where I will go through on my images and I'll show you exactly what I do to do each one of these particular things. These will be live so you can ask questions, et cetera, as well. And then the final thing I'll say is I have 2 more free upcoming presentations, and I have 2 more I haven't announced yet, but that are in the works. Fear in photography, we're going to talk about limiting beliefs and also emotions within our photography and how we can work through and kind of get over some of these things. And then discovery of our creative and artistic vision. This is another class I teach, and I'm going to talk about some of that creativity and that artistic vision portion of our work and what we might want to do, which is great. So, all right, we are just under an hour, which is going to be perfect. So I want to say thanks for this opportunity to be here with you guys tonight. So for me, finding my light within myself and in my photography has been tremendously rewarding. And so I hope for today, maybe this helped you to see your own light a little bit differently within your work. Find new ways to interact with it and to inspire you to keep on going, because hopefully the favorite photographer, favorite photograph you're going to take is the one you will take tomorrow. So plenty of time for questions. I will stop actually, I'm going to keep the share going because oftentimes people want to look at particular things or have questions. So I'm going to keep it going, but feel free to unmute yourself and ask away on questions or put them in the chat as well.
Okay. I have a question about your white balance. And you do that after the fact, after the picture's taken?
No, I do it first and foremost. And so I'll show it. I shouldn't talk about it unless I'm prepared to show it, right? So let me fire up Lightroom real quick and I'll show you how I do it. So I'll give Lightroom a quick second. All right, so we should be, so I'm going to start the share back on this screen. So we'll be back on this one now. So, all right, so now we're back in Lightroom. So this is a processed JPEG. So it's not going to look right. Let's just go in and I'll just pull a, doesn't matter. No, actually I'll pull more recent one. I'll go to Trona. We went to the Pinnacles a couple weeks ago. So let's go into a situation or I'm just going to pick a random image. So this one here, which you can probably see now, and I'll reset it back. And so what we're dealing with in this particular scene is we have a lot of dynamic range. I'm going to warm it up. I'm going to increase the exposure. So we have the sun coming up and then we have the blues in here. And so we could go to an auto white balance, or we can do as shot, the presets, et cetera. As shot's usually pretty good, but if we go to our vibrance and our saturation, what we're looking for, and maybe this one isn't the absolute best example, but what we're looking for is areas that are in the warm, that are having direct sun should be bright or orange. So we have the sun kind of coming up here. We'd expect that. And then the blues down in here are looking pretty good. So the as shot white balance is pretty good, but the tendency that you'll sometimes will see of people, especially with JPEG white balances or some of the other things, is you might see a scene like this, or a scene like this. And what you're looking for is the scene. You shouldn't have bleed of the bright light coming into your scene. Anything that's not getting direct light shouldn't be. We should have some color separation kind of going on within the sky as well. So we'll look at that tint, and you take it down too far, and then you'll start to bring it back, and you're watching the sky as you kind of bring it back a little bit as well. So we're wanting that directness within the sky to kind of get some of that. So something like that. And then you can look at your tint as well. So you can see where the green would look like, what too much magenta would look like. And you're kind of rocking these ever so slightly back and forth. So these are, by using the vibrant saturation, you're basically adding, I wouldn't say cheater blocks, but you're helping yourself to set a proper white balance or get much closer.
Oh, yeah.
As well. So.
Yeah, I'd have liked to seen some of the pictures you said would never see the light of day because of the white balance.
I can show you, might be able to show you a couple of them actually. I should actually keep them around. Oh, I do have a couple of them actually. Let me go back. So I keep them in my case study, wrong white balance one. So these are a couple of ones here. So this one, for example, just way too cool of a white balance actually for this particular scene, or this one here. Well, this one actually way better.
Yeah.
This one in halftone, it was really smoky. And so, but it's just got way too much warmth within the scene as a whole. And so it's I had to over process the image almost, but it's that warmth. It doesn't have the right color separation in the shadows to really be appropriate.
Okay. I get it.
Yeah. I don't want to look at that image too much longer. Makes my eyes hurt. Okay, so let's see other questions. I got the chat up now. So, okay, said, nice to think. Nice notes from some people. Thank you, David. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Pat. Okay, when backpacking, how do you keep weight to a minimum? Great question. While carrying your camera equipment, when I backpack, I never take all my camera gears. Geez, sometimes I cut the handle off my toothbrush. I like it, Denise. So a couple things on keeping weight to the minimum is I choose one lens typically. When I went out a couple, let's see, I can actually probably show them real quick. When I went out this last year to when the Neowise Comet was out, and I was in Yosemite, so I was catching two things. One, I was catching the Milky Way over Yosemite. So this image here, which if you're still on, you can see is the actual Milky Way looking towards Half Dome. And then I turned around the other direction and had the Neowise Comet. So that particular night, I had my tripod and two different lenses. But for the most part, I will not carry my tripod when I'm backpacking, and I'll rely on my handheld capability. So I can take my ISO really high and still be able to shoot really nice scenes, or I'll take a little teeny tiny tripod as well. The secondary backup I have is I have a Canon little Sure Shot zoom, and I should show everybody this because nobody believes me. So this one, let's see. I'll stop the share real quick. So if you can see my camera, so this camera here, this little 65 it's a Canon.
That's not seeing anything yet.
Oh, you're not seeing my camera? It's not on the share. It's actually held up to the thing. So it's a little teeny tiny Canon like power shot camera, $280. Really lightweight. I use that for backpacking too. And there was at least 5 or 6 images in the presentation tonight that were taken with that camera. So the megapixel sensor, I think it produces 13 or 11 megapixel images. So oftentimes, but photographing that thing in RAW, I can pull out really, really great images. So the RAW capabilities really will bring a lot of capability out. So give a sense of that. So good question. So another question, I've always shot in JPEG, but want to get into RAW. What's the best way to get off to a good start in RAW? What an excellent question, Charlie. So the best way to get off to a good start in RAW is to not try to do it all at once. And so all cameras, all digital cameras, you can photograph both RAW and JPEG. And so your camera will take both a RAW image and a JPEG image. It doesn't add any extra time to the processing speed. All it does is increase your memory card, which memory is cheap these days. And so you can have both images. And so you can see what the RAW image and the JPEG look like side by side and start to get a little bit of a sense of what changes you might want to make to the RAW file and start to figure out your processing workflow. It's the best way to start it, kind of wean yourself off of JPEG. The second best way to start it or work on it is, I would say, is presets in Lightroom. And so I like presets, especially for RAW images. So I always apply a preset to my RAW images, and then I'll oftentimes reset the image completely and reprocess it. So there's all kinds of preset packs. I have a preset pack for $10. You can find other ones on the internet as well, or build your own, or even use ones there. And those will get you in the ballpark on your RAWs, and then you can start to tweak and modify. So using those particular things as well. So, but great question, because it makes a difference. And I have a client that emailed me a couple of years ago that told me she was so resistant to shooting RAW. And I told her, just start capturing them and save them on a different card. And then if you ever want to go back, you'll have them later. And she emailed me and said, I want to thank you so much for convincing me to do that, because now I'm processing all my images and I was able to go back and salvage some ones from 2 or 3 years ago and blah, 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 and, which is great. So not to say I help everybody that way. So good question though. And feel free to, I'm happy to answer more on that one if you need so. Okay. Tom asks, what lens size do you take, zoom or prime? I don't have any prime lenses, actually. Everything I have is zoom. I have 3 lenses, 14 to 20. I shoot Nikon D810, Nikon D850, besides my little Canon backpack one. And those ones, the 14 to 24 is my wide angle f2.8, and that's for night photography in particular. And then I have a 28 to 300. And that one is my go-to lens. That is the one I keep on the camera most of the time. A, for when I'm backpacking, B, just going around, and I've actually photographed mostly on that one. And then I have a 200 to 500 that I use for telephoto stuff, and I have a tele extender. And so those are the ones I use. And that's if people ask if I'm only going to have one lens, I always tell them to get something like a 28 to a 300. So you can still do the long zoom capability, but you can still kind of have some of that capability for wide angle. So that's my favorite lens by a long shot. So. Okay. Other questions, either live or in the chat, either one.
I see a lot of depth of field. Do you focus stack?
So the only focal stacked image, and I'll show you real quick, that I have in the presentation is this one. That is the only focal stacked image I had in the presentation, and one of the only focal stacked ones I have. So this one is focus stacked and focal length blended. And so what happened here, so this is what this image looks like at 14 millimeter. And so this is 6 images stacked for the details and the textures within there. So to be able to get that there, but we bring down the actual size of the mountain so much from 14 millimeter. And so I waited a little longer and then took one with my 28 millimeter, actually at 34 millimeter, to be able to get the kind of the larger portion of what was there for the dune itself. So the eye doesn't, the full wide angle lens, for those of you that don't know, will make objects feel much smaller. This is a 555-foot dune, and I'm really close to the sand dune, and that wide angle has just shrunk that dune down. So this is much more close to what I saw in the particular thing. So that's the only image I had there, and one of the only ones I do. Oh, no, I take that back. The one I showed of the Shell Beach, where I talked a lot about cohesion, cohesiveness, that was a focal length, 3-image focal length blend. So, but I shoot a lot on f/16, which I can get really good depth of field out of, I find. So I don't do much focal length or focus stacking.
What program do you use for luminosity masking?
TK7, Tony Kuiper. So the TK panels are the ones I use. Janice asks, do you use your histogram to control highlights, or do you take multiple images and blend them? It's a great question. So let me try to think. Let's go back into portrait. I don't have very many. I'm just trying to make extra sure before I'm just kind of going through some of my, what I consider semi-portfolio images. And you can kind of see a little, I mean, it's pretty fast. These are all every single one of these is single image exposure. And so the dynamic range becomes, so even this image is, over here, single image. The dynamic range is always, oops, didn't want to go into full screen. Sorry about that. So yeah, I don't do a lot of I don't do a lot of exposure blending. Trying to think of a couple I do have that I did. I just don't. I underexpose for my highlights. And the example I gave, class I taught last week, which I'll show you real quick. So the one I showed, just give me 2 seconds to remember where I saved this one. Which class was I teaching? You guys are like, I don't know, I wasn't there. It was, I think it was this one. Just give me, it's somewhere in here. I want to find this one because it's a really good example of what my histogram looks like. It wasn't my luminosity mask. All right, I can't find it real quick. I could show one of these though. Okay, so let me look at this. So this one's like a final completed image. This actually is an exposure blend. And this one here is the raw file. And so you can see how unbelievably dark my histogram is. So I just made extra sure to protect every bit of my highlights. And then I have so much faith in being able to open up my shadows, being able to go into my tone curve and open up my shadows as well there, which is more of my midtones, bringing up my lights, slightly adjusting my exposure. Not a lot, just some. And I'm protecting the whole time. I'm protecting my highlights so they don't get overexposed. And I'm opening up all these different kind of variables to kind of keep the image intact. So that's the value of it, is that before and after, is that dynamic range and knowing how your camera works. You really minimize exposure blending. So that's that capability we have to really bring things back. So even a image like this one, which I'm going to teach in my teaching this image in my luminosity mask class, it was too dark to get in a single exposure because of the dynamic range. This was too dark, that was too bright here. So that one I did a double blending. I'll do a double blending to get it kind of further along. And I don't know, I don't have the final one in here, but I'll have it when I teach the class. So, because this is what you start to happen. So this one here, I'm trying to open up my shadows and my highlights, my shadows detail here, and keep my sky. And I'm losing that sky. I'm losing that blueness, that early morning sky here, because it's such a dynamic range. And so these are the kind of examples where I would use exposure blending. And that's what I'm going to demonstrate. So that's kind of a convoluted answer to your question, but yes, I do sometimes. I do bracketing sometimes to control highlights. Okay. Other questions? Or shall we allow people to get on with their evenings? I'll go cook dinner. Perfect. All right. Well, I'm going to not let the power go to my head, but I'm going to shut it down. And I will send out the recording sometime to you tomorrow, along with the materials and any other questions as well. Be sure to fire away. And I appreciate spending some time with you guys. Great questions. And feel free to fire back at me later with any feedback, concerns, or other questions. And otherwise, we'll see you again.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks much.
Thanks all.
Thank you for your time tonight.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.